By the time Silas Reed saw the shape in the snow, his mare had already tried twice to shy away from it. He pulled hard on the reins in that knife-cold dark and realized the drift at the edge of the creek had hands. The wind had laid her half under a crust of white, as if the night had been in the middle of burying her when he came along and interrupted it. One hand was bare. The fingers were blue at the tips. The other still clutched the strap of a leather satchel so tightly he had to pry each finger loose one by one. When he lifted her, she made no proper sound, just a broken breath against his coat, and he felt how little weight there was to her, how a human being could be reduced to almost nothing if the world kept taking. She smelled of cold wool, wet paper, and the faint copper tang of blood. Ink had dried in the grooves of her fingers. There was a bruise at the hinge of her jaw, another at her wrist, shaped too cleanly to have come from a fall. Her lashes fluttered once. He bent close to hear her over the wind. "Don't let him burn the book," she whispered. Then she was gone again. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. These stories travel better when they know who kept them company." Silas swung into the saddle with the woman in front of him, wrapped his coat around both of them, and turned the mare toward his lined cabin in the cottonwoods. The cold bit through his shirt, through the wool, through memory itself. He had lived alone so long that the sight of another cup on his table would have looked wrong to him. Another pair of boots by the door would have looked like a lie. Yet he rode with one gloved hand on the reins and the other spread over her ribs, counting each shallow breath as if he could hold them inside her by force. His cabin sat low against the wind, rough-hewn and stubborn, with one lantern burning in the window because winter dark came early and silence came earlier. He carried her in, laid her by the stove, and knelt. Her lips were nearly colorless. He rubbed her hands, cursed softly when he saw the raw welt at her ankle, the place where a boot had scraped skin. He fed split pine into the fire until the cabin snapped and breathed heat. He stripped the wet shawl from her shoulders, wrapped her in blankets, and held the tin cup to her mouth when he got coffee warm enough not to scald. Her head rolled weakly toward his voice. "Stay with me," he said, and for one strange instant it sounded to him like a plea instead of an order. "You hear me? Stay with me. You'll never be alone again." He did not know why he said it. Perhaps because the cabin had heard too much dying in other winters. Perhaps because once you had buried everybody who belonged to you, the sight of one more person slipping away made something wild rise up in the chest. An hour later, hoofbeats passed on the ridge. Silas went still. The mare in the lean-to gave a soft, uneasy blow. He blew out the lantern, opened the rifle rack, and stood in the dark with the barrel across his forearm. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Slow. Searching. They did not stop then. They went on toward the north fence line. At dawn, the woman woke with the cast-iron poker in both hands and enough fear in her face to make him back up at once. "Easy," Silas said. "If I meant you harm, I'd have done it while you were senseless." That did not calm her. Her eyes moved fast, taking in the room, the stove, the bed, the door, him. They were gray eyes, but not the soft kind. Winter gray. The kind that had seen accounts settled unfairly and remembered every figure. "Where am I?" "My cabin." "Who are you?" "Silas Reed." She swallowed, then winced at the effort. "If they followed me. They didn't last night." "Last night." Her gaze dropped to the blankets around her, then to the wool shirt he had left folded at the chair because hers had been frozen stiff. Pride and panic crossed her face in the same breath. "You changed. I kept you alive." That landed. She looked at him again, this time not as a threat, exactly, but as a problem not yet solved. "My satchel." He nudged it toward her with his boot. She reached for it so fast the blankets fell from one shoulder, exposing a bruise the color of storm clouds. He saw the mark of fingers there too. "Who did that?" he asked. Her jaw set. "A man with money." Silas almost said that described half the territory, but the sound of hooves in the yard stopped him. A fist hit the door. Not loud. Confident. Silas took the rifle and went to answer. A line of cold came in around the frame when he pulled the door open. Amos Pike stood there in a black hat whitened at the brim by snow, his beard rimed with frost, his smile thin as fence wire. 2 other riders waited behind him, both wearing Hollis Vane's silver concho brand on their saddle skirts. "Morning, Reed," Amos said. He had a way of speaking like every word had already been measured for weight. "We're looking for a thief. Woman. Dark hair." Mean little thing when cornered. Silas leaned one shoulder to the door. Plenty of mean little things in this country. Coyotes. Lone men. Men who knock before sunup. Amos's smile did not change. This one stole private papers from Mr. Vane's office and assaulted a deputy in the doing. Then I'd ask at the deputy's house. Amos glanced past him, just enough to tell Silas he meant to. She won't make it far in weather like this. If she comes through, best remember whose land this is. Silas looked out over Amos's shoulder at the whitening fields, the river flat under ice, the mountains distant and pale. Weather like this belongs to itself. For the first time the smile slipped. Amos nodded once. Mr. Vane says if you shelter her, you make her crime your own. Silas's hand tightened on the rifle, but his voice stayed quiet. Then you'd best hope I haven't. He shut the door in the man's face and dropped the bar in place. That was the moment the world tipped. Not when he found her. Not when he spoke those strange words by the stove. It tipped when he lied for her and heard the lie settle into the wood of his house like a nail driven home. When he turned, she was standing though she had no strength for it, one hand on the table, the other gripping the satchel. You shouldn't have done that, she said. Probably not. You don't know what's in this. No. He set the rifle down, slow and visible. But I know the sort of man who sends Amos Pike to fetch it. She stared at him for a long beat, then sank back onto the chair as if the standing alone had cost her more than she could spare. Her breath shook once before she mastered it. My name is Ada Bell, she said. My father kept the books at the Larkspur Mercantile until his sight went bad. Hollis Vane hired me after he died because I was quiet and plain and easy to forget in a room. Men say a great deal in front of women they don't consider worth noticing. Silas said nothing. She took that for permission to go on. Vane bought up notes on widows' land, soldiers' claims, small ranches after the bad grass year. Then he changed the due dates in the ledgers and filed the altered pages with the county. People thought they were behind when they weren't. If they argued, the sheriff came. If they kept arguing, something burned. Her fingers rested on the satchel. Not gentle. Protective. I copied his letters. I stamped his receipts. I heard every bargain. 3 nights ago, I found the original ledger in his safe and the signatures he'd kept off the books. Men he cheated. Women he lied to. He means to take 6 more homesteads by month's end. Mine among them. Mrs. Coulter's. Ruth Calder's boarding house lot. Half this valley, one snowstorm at a time. Why not go to the sheriff? A humorless sound left her. Sheriff Morrow eats at Vane's table every Sunday. Judge. Circuit Judge Barlow rides through Larkspur tomorrow night for the tax hearing. She looked up then, and something fierce showed beneath the exhaustion. If those papers reach him before Vane gets his hands on them, he can't talk his way free. Silas moved to the window. Frost feathered the corners of the glass. Outside, the cottonwoods clicked in the wind like old bones. He had spent 5 years making his life small enough that no one could take much from it. One cabin, one mare, a few cattle on lease, a name mostly spoken by no one. Small lives were easier to keep from breaking. You ought to leave before dark, he said finally. Rest till noon. I'll hitch you to the south road. Her face closed. So you can tell yourself you help without taking the real risk. He looked back at her. Most people, seeing how quiet he was, mistook it for softness. Ada Bell did not. She saw it for what it had become over the years, a wall built out of grief and used too often. You don't know me, he said. No, she answered. But I know what fear looks like when it's had years to put down roots. That one struck deep because it was true. He rode to town at midday for quinine, bandage cloth, and lamp oil, telling himself that was all. The road into Larkspur ran hard as iron under the hoof, rutted where wagon wheels had frozen and thawed and frozen again. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue threads. A dog barked once at his mare, then thought better of it. The town had the brittle feeling of a room where an argument had stopped just before he entered. Men at the hitch rail lowered their voices. Old Mr. Tully at the mercantile rubbed the same spot on the counter with his apron until the wood shone. Sheriff Morrow stood outside the bank with one thumb hooked under his left suspender, the way he always did when he was trying to look unbothered. Near the church lot, Mrs. Coulter stood in the yard of her own place with a valise at her feet, while 2 of Vane's hands carried her chair out through the front door and set it in the snow. Her grandson, a little boy no more than 7, held a bird cage with no bird in it and cried soundlessly, the way children do when they are too frightened to spend breath. Past due, one of the hands said when Silas reined up. Nothing personal. Mrs. Coulter was old enough that the cold had already made her mouth tremble. My note isn't due till March. The man shrugged. Funny thing. Ledger says January. Silas felt something old and sour turn over in him. He had seen this before. Not this family. Not this yard. But this shape of cruelty. The smooth paper version of a gun held to the throat. Across the street, Ruth Calder was pinning sheets on the boarding house line, though nothing would dry in such weather. She was a compact woman with iron hair and shoulders like a woman who had carried too many trunks for too many years. She caught Silas's eye only once, then looked at Mrs. Coulter, then at him again. It was not a plea. It was worse. It was disappointment offered in advance. Back at the mercantile, while Tully wrapped the quinine, he said under his breath, "They're calling the girl a thief because it sounds cleaner than murdered." Silas looked up. Tully still rubbed the counter. "Vane's got riders on the north and east roads," the old man murmured. "If you know anything useful, now would be the time to be less proud than usual." On the ride home, the medicine knocked at Silas's thigh inside his coat pocket. So did memory. His wife's hands, red from wash water. His little daughter asleep in a chair with her cheek against the window ledge, waiting for him to come in from a cattle drive he should never have taken. Hollis Vane had held the note on his place that winter too. Work the drive or lose the land. Silas had chosen the work. By the time he got home, fever had taken both of them and the land went anyway. A man could spend years pretending there was honor in surviving a thing like that. Truth was, survival and cowardice sometimes were the same coat. When he came in with the medicine, Ada was seated at his table with the ledger pages spread by the stove on clean cloths to dry. Her hair was braided now, severe and practical. She had found enough strength to stand squarely on her own feet. There was color in her face. Anger had brought some of it back. "I thought you weren't coming," she said. "I thought about it. That honest. That or nothing." He set the supplies down. For a while neither of them spoke. Only the stove did, and the dry hiss of paper near heat. Then Ada picked up one thin page between careful fingers. "If they search me again, they'll find these." Silas frowned. "Then we hide them better. In this cabin?" She gave a tired half-smile. "A man like Amos would pull up floorboards." Silas looked at the bedroll strapped beside the wall. Its blue wool seam split near the bottom where a spur had once caught it. "Not if they think like men." Ada followed his gaze. After a moment, understanding moved over her face like dawn. "You know how to sew?" he asked. She actually laughed then, the first sound from her not weighted entirely with fear. "Mr. Reed, I have spent 6 years making myself useful in ways men do not notice." She held up the needle from his mending tin. "Folks think being ignored makes a woman small. Mostly it just teaches her where men keep the keys." That was the first line of the story people would carry with them, though neither of them knew it then. She stitched by lamplight while he cleaned the rifle and listened to the wind. Her hands were steady even after the cold, even after the beating. Once, when the thread knotted, he almost reached to help and stopped himself. Some work a person needed to see through alone. At dusk the mare snorted sharply. Then came the smell of smoke. Silas was out the door before Ada could rise. Flame licked the far side of the hay shed. Not large yet, meant to draw him. He swung around in time to see 3 riders sliding through the trees toward the cabin proper. "Inside," he shouted. But Ada was already at the back wall, shoving the stitched bedroll at him and grabbing the shotgun he kept over the door. Their eyes met once, and in that instant the choice between leaving and fighting fell away like rotten rope. If you had been in her place, with the whole town calling you a liar, and one lonely man, the only soul left willing to stand between you and the dark, would you have trusted him? Tell me in the comments, because this is the moment everything was decided. The first shot shattered the window over the wash basin. Then the night opened. Silas fired once from the porch. A rider pitched sideways out of the saddle. Ada sent both barrels through the front glass before the horse hit the ground. Smoke filled the room. Pine splinters stung his face. The mare screamed in the lean-to and kicked Wood apart. "Back," he barked. They went through the rear door into the cottonwoods, low and fast. Snow slapped his boots. Ada stumbled once and caught herself. Good. Better that way. He trusted people more when they got up angry. He cut the mare loose, shoved the bedroll under his arm, and swung Ada up bareback before climbing behind her. Gunfire cracked through the trees. Bark jumped from a trunk inches from his shoulder. He turned the mare not south to the open road, but west into the creek bed where the drifts ran deep enough to swallow tracks by morning. The cold hit like fists. Ada lay low against the horse's neck with one hand on the mane and the other clutching the saddle horn. Once she looked back, and he saw fire reflected in her eyes where his cabin burned against the dark. They rode blind for a quarter-mile, maybe more. Time got thin in weather like that. It broke into breaths and hoofbeats and the hard punch of fear. At a rise above the frozen wash, Silas slid down and dragged a pine branch behind them, sweeping the trail where it opened onto bare ground. Then he led the mare across stone and into the dry arroyo that wound toward the abandoned schoolhouse at Miller's Bend. Ada watched him work, teeth chattering so hard he heard them over the wind. "You've done this before. Tracking, hiding." Silas did not answer. She saw the answer anyway. "You rode for him once." There it was. Not from him. From the shape of his silence. He kept moving. A long time ago. How long? Long enough to know what kind of man he is. That wasn't the question. He stopped then because the truth deserved facing at least once in a life. Snow drifted around them. The mare's flanks steamed. Somewhere behind, faint and ugly in the dark, men shouted to one another. "Yes," he said. "I rode for Vane. Broke horses. Drove cattle. Carried out orders I told myself were just business." Ada's face went white in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "How many homes did you ride past while families begged you not to?" "Too many," he thought. Out loud he said, "Enough." She turned away. It was a small movement, but it cut deeper than accusation. They reached the schoolhouse after midnight. It leaned to one side, long since abandoned when the district line moved east. Half the windows were gone. The chalkboard still hung at the front of the room, ghost pale in the moonlight. Silas got a fire going in the stove with old splintered desks and shut the mare in the shed behind the building. Ada sat on a bench without speaking. She did not thank him. He did not ask her to. At first light, Amos Pike found them. The schoolhouse door burst inward so hard it struck the wall. Silas got one hand to the rifle before the shot came through the window and drove a red-hot iron through his side. He staggered. Ada screamed his name once, and the room filled with the sound of boots. "Drop it," Amos called, "or I let the next one take her." Silas's fingers opened. The rifle hit the floorboards. Amos stepped in smiling, snow on his shoulders, pistol steady. "Mr. Vane says you've grown sentimental in your old age." Ada stood behind the teacher's desk with the shotgun, but two men had already circled the side windows. She knew the angles. She knew she was beaten for the moment. Her knuckles whitened on the stock. "Where are the papers?" Amos asked. "In hell by now. If there's any order to the world," Silas said. Amos crossed the room and pistol whipped him hard across the temple. Silas went to one knee. Blood hit the floor in dark drops. Ada took one step forward. "Stop. That's better." Amos did not look at Silas again. Mr. Vane was right. All you had to do was hurt the right thing. From outside came another sound. Not a horse this time. More dangerous. Wood being stacked against the wall. Ada heard it too. Her face changed. Amos saw and grinned. "Last chance. The papers, or we smoke you out like rats." Silas looked up through the blood in his eye. "Don't," he said to her. It was not a noble speech. Not a hero's declaration. Just one word spoken by a man who had already lost everything worth keeping once before and would rather die than watch a second life be handed over because of him. Amos cocked the pistol and set it to Silas's head. Ada's hand loosened on the shotgun, and that was where the world seemed to stop. In an old schoolhouse that smelled of dust and lampblack, with firewood scraping the outer wall and the man she had trusted on his knees in front of the man who wanted her dead. The back wall blew inward first. Not from flame. From the mare. Silas's old dun had kicked through the rotten boards of the shed, panicked by smoke, and burst wild through the rear lean-to in a spray of splinters. The nearest rider shouted and went down under hooves. Silas lunged on instinct, driving shoulder first into Amos's legs. The pistol fired. The bullet tore through the brim of Ada's hat and buried itself in the blackboard. Then everything moved at once. Ada swung the shotgun like an axe and caught Amos at the wrist. The pistol skidded under a bench. Silas came up bloody and half-blind, hit one man with the stove poker, shoved another into the iron heater hard enough to crack the door off its hinge. Smoke poured in through the walls. Someone outside yelled that the north side was lit. "Cellar," Silas choked. There was an old potato cellar under the trap at the teacher's platform. Ada yanked it open, got under Silas's good arm, and half dragged, half lowered him into the dirt dark just as fire took the roof edge with a roar. That was the longest hour of their lives. The cellar was barely high enough to kneel in, lined with cold-packed earth that smelled of roots and damp clay. Smoke seeped through the seams overhead. Silas slumped against the wall with one hand pressed to his side. Blood ran between his fingers. Ada tore her petticoat hem and made bandages while fire thudded above them, and ash sifted down like black snow. When she tightened the strip across the wound, he sucked in air through his teeth but made no other sound. "You can curse if you like," she said, voice shaking. "Wouldn't improve it." That nearly broke her. She sat back on her heels, stood on her cheek, hair half loose from the braid, and for the first time since he found her by the creek, she looked less angry than tired clear through the bones. "Why did you come back from town?" she asked. Silas rested his head against the dirt wall. "Because I saw them put an old woman in the snow for a note she didn't know. Because I knew that look on the boy's face. Because I've spent 5 years telling myself grief made me a man worth pardoning, when most days it just made me careful." Above them the schoolhouse groaned as a beam gave way. Ada sat very still. "What happened to your family?" There was no room left for lying underground. "Fever," he said. "Winter drive." Vane held the paper on my place. "Said if I didn't ride, I'd lose it. So I rode. Told Clara I'd be back before the cold turned mean. Weather changed. River rose. By the time I got home, the lamp had burned out and both of them were under quilts I wasn't there to tuck around them." He swallowed once. "I kept thinking if I lived quiet enough after that, I wouldn't fail anybody else." Ada wiped her eyes with the heel of a blackened hand and left a streak there. "The loneliest thing in the world isn't an empty house," she said. "It's a full room where nobody would notice if you stopped speaking." That was the line people would write down and carry into their own evenings. Silas looked at her then, properly looked, and saw all the years behind her face. Not old years. Heavy ones. Years of being talked over, passed by, used for neat handwriting and steady accounts, and never once asked what she knew. "My brothers sent me to Vane's office after father died," she said. "Said figures were quiet work for quiet women. I sat in the corner and added columns while men traded land like cards. Every widow they laughed at. Every drunk they cheated. Every lie. I remembered all of it because there was no one else to remember for." Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. "When I took that ledger, I didn't do it because I was brave. I did it because I got tired of being the sort of person men placed in a room and forgot." The fire above them shifted. Snowmelt began dripping through the beams. The worst of it had moved on. Silas reached into the pocket of his ruined coat and drew out a little brass harmonica no longer than his palm. The finish was worn off one side. "This was May's," he said. "She never learned to play it proper. Just like the sound it made when she was pleased with herself." He laid it in Ada's hand. "I've kept it in a drawer because it hurt too much to hear. Feels to me like things that hurt ought to earn their keep." Ada closed her fingers around it, as if it were something holy. "If this story is moving you tonight," the narrator in every quiet room might say here, "then it was written for the places people carry hidden under their everyday lives." A like and a subscribe tells us to keep bringing these home. Then the fire settles, and we go on. When enough silence had passed between them to turn gentle, Silas said, "I can't promise easy." Ada looked up. "But I can promise I won't be the one who leaves." No grandness. No poetry for its own sake. Just a truth laid carefully between two broken people like a board across deep water. They waited until the heat above them faded and the voices moved off, convinced perhaps that no one could live through that blaze. By dusk they crawled out into a world gone blue with cold again, the schoolhouse a black shell against the snow. The mare stood a little way off under the cottonwoods, sides caked in soot but alive. Silas laughed once at the sight of her, the sound rough with pain. Ada found the bedroll where it had been flung beneath the broken teacher's platform. The stitches still held. "Good," she said. "Good." Silas leaned on the shovel handle. She'd found him for a crutch. "Woman, we're half-burned, shot through, and being hunted." She met his look with a spark in her eyes he had not seen before. "Yes, and they still don't know where the truth is. They could have ridden south that night, left the valley, let Hollis Vane swallow one more town and call it the way of the world. Instead they went east, toward Larkspur, toward the hearing, toward every face that would rather not know. That was the hard choice. Not surviving. Returning. The next morning, the church hall filled early because bad weather never kept folks from the chance to watch power arrange itself. Farmers stamped snow from boots at the door. Women shook shawls out by the stove. Sheriff Morrow stood near the front with his hand too close to his holster. Hollis Vane waited by the judge's table in a dark broadcloth coat, silver watch chain bright against his vest, looking less like a cattle baron than a banker with an appetite. He smiled when he saw Ada enter. Not because he was pleased, because he thought he had already won. She came in on Silas's arm, pale but upright, wearing Ruth Calder's spare coat and her own bruises like testimony. People turned to stare. Whispering moved through the hall like wind through dry grass. Ruth Calder, all iron spine and no ceremony, stepped from the back row and gave Ada a single nod before sitting down. Mrs. Calder was there too, the little grandson pressed against her skirt. Tully from the mercantile, men from the livery. Women Vane had expected to frighten quiet. The room was fuller than he liked. Judge Barlow, narrow-faced and tired from travel, began reading the docket. Vane interrupted twice, smooth and practiced, to mention theft, disorder, malicious accusations. Ada stood still through all of it. Then Judge Barlow asked whether any citizen wished to contest the filings before the tax record was entered. Ada stepped forward. Sheriff Morrow moved as if to stop her, but Silas's hand came to rest on the back of a chair in a way that said he needed no gun to make the next minute expensive. Morrow paused. "My name is Ada Bell," she said, clear enough that the room settled around her voice. "I kept Mr. Vane's books. The notes he has filed against these families are altered." Vane laughed softly. "Your Honor, the woman stole documents from my office and has been wandering the territory inventing stories because she fears prison." Ada did not look at him. "Mr. Vane depends on two things. That poor people do not keep papers, and that plain women do not keep memories." That line hit the room hard. Judge Barlow folded his hands. "Do you have proof of your claim, Miss Bell?" Ada turned then, not to her satchel, not to some hidden pocket Vane had already searched in his imagination, but to the worn blue bedroll strapped behind Silas's shoulder. In the silence, she knelt and unpicked the seam. The first papers slid free like trapped birds finally allowed daylight. Then more. Ledger leaves. Original notes. Signatures. Receipts bearing dates that did not match the county filings. The whole hall leaned toward her without meaning to. Hollis Vane's face emptied. Ada laid the papers across the judge's table one by one with hands that did not shake. Mrs. Calder's note, due March 12th. Changed to January on the filed copy. Ruth Calder's lot deed, signed in full for extension after the fire. Omitted from record. Widow Harlan's receipt marked paid in blue-black ink, later scratched through in green. Mr. Vane uses green when he alters dates because the copper in his office inkwell catches light and pleases him. Judge Barlow looked up sharply. Ada kept going. That was her victory. Not loudness. Not fury. Precision. She named sums, dates, parcel numbers, witnesses. She named them all because years of being dismissed had sharpened her into an instrument. Every time Vane tried to interrupt, she answered with another figure. Every time he smiled, she peeled another falsehood open in front of the room. Then Ruth Calder rose from the back bench. "I was present when my extension was signed," she said, "and I watched Mr. Vane's clerk refuse to file it." Mrs. Calder stood next, then Tully, then a rancher named Ben Haskell whose hand still bore the scar from the day his barn burned. One by one they came forward, not rescuing Ada, but joining the ground she had already claimed. Vane saw the room turning and made his last mistake. He stopped pretending. "These people would have lost those scraps of land in a year anyway," he snapped. "I merely took them before incompetence could." His gaze cut to Ada like a knife. "And you? Nobody looked at you because there was nothing to see." Silas moved before anyone else. Not fast, not theatrical. Just one step that put him between Ada and the man who had built a life on other people's helplessness. "That," Silas said quietly, "is where you've always been a fool." Vane went for the pistol under his coat. Silas had spent years letting men think grief had hollowed him out. What it had actually done was strip him down to what mattered. He caught Vane's wrist, turned it, drove the man's hand into the table edge until the pistol fell. Vane gasped, tried to wrench free, and Silas put him face first across the judge's ledger in front of every person he had ever threatened behind closed doors. The room did the rest. Sheriff Morrow did not draw. Perhaps he saw which way the current had turned. Perhaps he was tired of being owned. Judge Barlow ordered Vane and Amos Pike taken into custody on fraud, tampering, assault, and arson pending territorial review. Tully, who looked frail enough to blow away in a stiff wind, was the first man to seize Amos's arm. Others followed. Hollis Vane shouted then. Promises. Threats. Names of men with influence. Names of banks. Names of judges beyond this one. It no longer mattered. His watch chain snapped against the table edge when he struggled. Ada looked at the broken silver links and thought, maybe for the first time in months, that justice sometimes sounded like metal giving way. By evening, the town that had pretended not to see her could speak of little else. Mrs. Coulter got her house back before sunset. Ruth Calder's lot was restored by written order. Barlow sealed Vane's books and sent riders to the county seat with notice to freeze every transfer bearing his mark. Within a month his cattle were sold to satisfy debts he himself had fabricated. The boarding house lot Ada's father had lost came back into her name. So did 3 acres behind it with a stand of cottonwoods and an old well that still ran sweet in spring. Silas did not rebuild the line cabin where it had burned. He and Ada raised something new on the recovered land instead, with a wide porch and 2 windows facing west so evening light could not help but come in. Ruth sent over curtains she pretended were too plain for her own house. Tully delivered nails and charged half. Mrs. Coulter's grandson hung about with a hammer too large for him and was tolerated because he worked hard and asked earnest questions. People said Silas smiled more. That was true, though not in any way that made a spectacle of itself. Mostly it showed in how he paused at the gate when Ada called his name, as if being wanted somewhere was still a thing he had not quite grown used to. Ada opened a little office by the mercantile 2 mornings a week to help neighbors read notes, keep accounts, and understand what they were signing before they put pen to paper. Men who once would have spoken over her now sat down and listened. And in the first green edge of spring, when the creek broke loose and ran laughing again over stone, Silas drove out a small herd with Ada beside him on the buckskin mare he'd gentled for her. She rode straight-backed and sure, hat brim low, one hand light on the reins. Half the valley waved them past, as if what had happened in that church hall had been more than a case decided. Maybe it had. Maybe it had been a town remembering that goodness grows teeth when it has to. Months later, on an evening soft enough to leave the windows open, the porch lamp cast a warm square over the yard while supper cooled between them and the cottonwoods whispered in the dark. Ada had May's old brass harmonica in her apron pocket, though she still could not play more than 3 proper notes, and Silas sat with his boots off, listening to her laugh at herself each time the tune went crooked. He had once believed a good life arrived all at once or not at all. Turns out it comes the way dawn does. First a line of light, then enough warmth to believe in. And when she reached across the table and took his hand as if she had always known where it belonged, the last of the lonely years went quiet, and the lamplight held them in the doorway while the gold of sunset thinned over the pasture and their joined shadows stretched long across the grass. And next time, stay with us for the story of the deaf woman sent to a hard ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who was the first man alive to see exactly who she was.